I want to talk about the greatest mistake the Romans ever made that you've never heard of. The Corinth Canal was finished in 1893, and it cuts through the Isthmus of Corinth. This shortens the journey around the Peloponnese by 700 kilometres, and was a marvel of modern Greek engineering when it was finished. My understanding is it's also an economic failure. Modern ships were too big to pass through it. The Aegean was an international backwater, and there wasn't that much trade going around, and any trade that did need to go around the Peloponnese could safely do so because of modern navigational techniques like weather reports and much better mapping of the coastline. It seems to me, had the Romans had the canal, it would have been hugely successful. So why didn't they? Several kings, pharaohs and emperors attempted to build the canal, or at least considered it. But the most pertinent one to talk about is Nero, who actually started to build it. I mean, quite literally, he started to build it. It's recorded that he, with a golden pickaxe, dug the first handful of soil. And then 6,000 slaves did most of the work for some time afterwards, and they managed to dig about 800 metres, and you could just about still see the remains of that. But the Romans were great engineers, right? They found the exact best spot to build the canal and the exact right angle to build it at, such that when modern engineers went to build the canal, they built it exactly where the Romans had. If the canal was started and not finished, it begs the question, was it possible? Now, I've seen a variety of speculation, and none of it's quite satisfactory. There's speculation that the Roman state couldn't afford it, but this was at the same time Nero was building a golden palace on the Capitoline Hill. I've also seen speculation that it was simply started too close to the end of Nero's reign, not that he knew it, and that it was dropped as a project in the year of the four emperors. Perhaps the most compelling notion is that Nero had been informed that the waters in the Saronic Gulf and the Corinthian Gulf were at different levels, and that building the canal would cause the island of Aegina to be flooded. Now, this notion comes up in a few places, but there's a really interesting dialogue from Lucian that utterly destroys it in terms of practicality. Like, the Romans were aware that this was not true, even if Nero thought it was true. And so it raises the question, why did no other emperor do it? I've seen speculation that any emperor who built the Corinth Canal would die and that it was cursed. And the Romans were a pretty superstitious bunch, so it's very possible that that could be the case. Let's re-roll the dice and ask who could have built it. I feel the most obvious candidate would be Hadrian. Hadrian was a renowned Grecophile, and he visited Corinth in 124-125 AD. Furthermore, the empire under Hadrian was the empire at its most powerful. It was following on from the conquests of Trajan. Hadrian accomplished a great many things during his time as emperor, but the most famous by far was the ordering of the construction of Hadrian's Wall in the north of England. Now, Hadrian's Wall can hardly be argued as a massive success. It's pretty borderline as to how useful it really was, aside from demarcating the boundary between civilization and barbarism. But it provides quite a good indication of what the Roman Empire was capable of when they put their mind to a mega project. So, just some numbers here. Hadrian's Wall used 2 million cubic meters of stone, and obviously it was built by 3 legions over 6 years in the north of Britain. The Corinth Canal would require the excavation of 12 million meters cubed of material, but no transportation of that material, and it was right in the heart of the empire. So there's no kind of construction part. You just, excavate the material, take it down to the kind of whichever coastline you're closest to on the isthmus, and just float it anywhere, which is out of the way, right? Which is a fairly simple task, and I think one which is indicative of kind of Rome's capabilities to do it. So I guess what we're basically saying is if you trade Hadrian's Wall, you might be able to get a Corinth Canal. What would have been the benefits to the Roman Empire of building the Corinth Canal? I feel like the best way of understanding this is to use the fascinating and fantastic Roman Orbis tool. For those of you who don't know, Roman Orbis allows you to pick any 2 points in the Roman Empire, usually cities, and say, okay, I want to travel at a certain season, and I want that travel to be the fastest possible or the cheapest possible. Now, it is basically a rule of trade networks that the cheapest solution is the best, not the fastest. Fastest is great for information and militaries, but cheapest wins out overall. Now, what you can basically see is if you choose any points in kind of the northern Aegean or Black Sea and the kind of northern Mediterranean, so everywhere kind of north of the Peloponnese, you get this really interesting dynamic, right? Where the fastest route goes across to Corinth, then they jump out of a ship, go onto dry land, jump on a ship the other side and start sailing. But the cheapest route is to stay on a ship and just go all the way south around the Peloponnese. Now, what building the Corinth Canal does is it means that the fastest route and the cheapest route are one and the same now. And the kind of effect of that is to save 3 days of travel on every single voyage from east to west or vice versa, which is kind of in the northern half of the Mediterranean, Aegean and Black Sea kind of area. And that's that's amazing, right? That's for a journey that takes 20 days, it takes 24 days from Rome to Constantinople. Take 3 days off. You've made it, about 10% faster. I unfortunately don't have any estimates for the amount of kind of sea traffic and cargo that moves in this kind of area and what the actual benefit would be. But if you assume that the canal is in operation for a minimum of 300 years and you make all of the journeys in about half of the Roman world 10% faster, then it seems clear to me it pays for itself many times over. I want to give just a little bit more detail here on how it would be helpful. So as you go south round the Peloponnese, there are 2 capes called Cape Malea and Cape Matapan, and these were well renowned for kind of strong gales that would wreck ships. Right, so it's a much safer route if you can go via Corinth. A route being safer and faster for the same cost is a recipe for economic growth, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that the Corinth Canal would better connect east and west. I don't think it's too far to go further and say it would have given the east a greater stake in defending the west if this route had existed. but it didn't. The implication really being that the fall of the West may have played out very differently if, the Corinth Canal had been made and it was 3 days faster to send troops from east to west via ship. That's a huge difference. In this video so far, we've talked about some of the real history behind the Corinth Canal and what could have been. We've talked about some of the economic history, which, due to the Roman Orbis project, is fairly well understood. We are now going to kind of go a bit further, and for anyone who's a very purist historian, please stop listening now. You won't enjoy this last part. It's too speculatory, it's too silly, but it's fascinating. So anyone else who wants to stick around, please do. If I had to title this third part, it would be Corinth, a new imperial capital? Let me explain. The existence of the canal, built in the 120s, 130s AD by Hadrian, would clearly bring much economic wealth to kind of the Corinth area. There'd be so much more traffic passing through. The city would be able to extract levies on any ships that it wanted to, if that's the direction it decided to go, or if nothing else, it would be able to sell goods to people looking to stock up their cargo or ships as they were passing through. So there's a lot of money to be made if you're in Corinth and there's a Corinth Canal. We can kind of assume that Corinth is growing to be a middling-sized city at this time. Much more so than the kind of, I would describe it as this kind of smaller town. It's possibly a bit fairer at this time. And we can assume that, some of the really kind of broad picture stuff in Roman history isn't going to be changed by the existence of the canal. Like, my view is the crisis of the 3rd century would still happen. But I think there's some specific parts where it can start to go differently. So, for example, the safest place in the entirety of Greece is the Peloponnese. And it's the safest place because it's behind this isthmus that's 6 miles wide, also. And if you haven't looked at a photo of the Corinth Canal, we're going to have one up on screen now. Now, the Corinth Canal is about 30 metres wide and 60 to 90 metres deep. For those of you who lack imagination, it's a moat, right? And it's a moat on one of the most defensible parts of Greece already, right? So the crisis of the 3rd century is happening, and the Gothic people are raiding kind of the Balkans and Greece regularly until they're defeated primarily by Aurelian and Claudius Gothicus. Just to give some context, in real life, Corinth was sacked in around 267 AD, but with the Corinth Canal, or as we've put it, the greatest moat of antiquity, I don't see how they would have been able to sack it. A force 10 times smaller could hold that canal against an invading army, right? So what we've actually described here is that the Peloponnese, having been turned from a peninsula into an island, is now actually a safe haven, a fortress, a sanctuary for all the people in Greece who were worried about invaders from the north. So in this kind of alternate history, the Peloponnese is swelling in population as refugees are coming in, and they're then protected by this canal, right? Which is the obvious point to hold land-based invaders, which is effectively what the Goths were at that time. So the context is we've got a much richer, much more well-populated, much safer part of the empire than we otherwise would have done due to the existence of the canal. And, if you will, let's assume that there is a similar reforming figure to Constantine, or Constantine himself, if we haven't broken our timeline too much with kind of alternate history shenanigans from the existence of the Corinth Canal. Now, Constantine obviously is probably most famous for his Christianity and the foundation of Constantinople. Now, Rome was far too pagan a city for Constantine. He needed basically a blank slate to work with. Interestingly, Corinth is also a bit of a blank slate. It was completely destroyed in 146 BC, at the end of the kind of same time as the end of the Third Punic War. And it was only refounded in 44 BC by Julius Caesar. So it hadn't had that hugely long established history of paganism because of its kind of break and refounding. Furthermore, Corinth is an incredibly important city in the Bible, right? There is a whole chapter of the Bible called Corinthians, which would be of huge appeal for someone looking to kind of show off their new religious tendencies and beliefs. So then we start talking about other benefits, right? So Constantinople is at a crossroads of east and west. With the Corinth Canal, so would Corinth be. Constantinople is incredibly well defended, with 3 sides being water and a side being shorter. Corinth would be incredibly well defended, with 1 short side facing north, 2 sides with water, and the south is completely protected because it's not connected to anywhere else. Just keep in mind that to actually encircle the city of Corinth, you would need to have 2 separate armies, one on the north, one on the south. You would need to have 2 separate navies, one on the east, one on the west. Right? You need to have 4 separate units cooperating in tandem to have a hope of surrounding the city of Corinth with the existence of the canal. And the long walls, which if you were going to have an imperial capital, you would absolutely kind of make sure you have the long walls similar to kind of how Athens had long walls back in 4th century BC, I think is the date. You would just make them better, right? If you were going to have long walls in Corinth, you would have on the Isthmus you would have the canal. You would have walls like the Theodosian walls, or actually like the kind of real hexamilian walls, which hexamilian meaning 6 miles. The Isthmus is 6 miles wide. Justinian first built them, and they lasted. They were still in use in the 1400s, once repaired. So you would have kind of canal wall, and then to the south you would have another wall that kind of runs the entirety of east to west. Now maybe this isn't kind of the city wall. Maybe it's the the equivalent of like the Anastasian wall in Constantinople, but you would basically make sure that you could get to either coastline entirely without having to kind of leave the kind of urbs or suburbs of Corinth, right? And if you really had enough money to do it, you would build that wall along the kind of top of the Onea Mountains, and that would kind of make them pretty impenetrable to get through. I can show you that as we kind of fly around here. Now, my understanding is this is an entirely unique situation in the entirety of human history, perhaps. Perhaps Panama City in Panama has the same kind of layout, but it's obviously a very different environment. Similarly, again to Constantinople, there were great fish stocks in the Saronic and Corinthian Gulfs, which would help keep the city fed, just as Constantinople had access to great fishing stocks. So there's a lot of broad similarities, where it's not a gigantic stretch to say that the existence of the canal would enable Corinth to be chosen as an imperial capital, and a huge amount of investment could then be poured into it to give it whatever it needed. Extra walls to kind of go on one side or either side of the moat, harbours, cisterns, whatever it is that is required, right? It has this kind of strategic geography of linking east and west and having that trade route going through it. It's got the kind of tactical geography of being impossible to siege by anything other than entirely, utterly overwhelming kind of early modern to modern forces. I don't see how anyone could breach that canal if there were walls on it, so you need to have a kind of combined land and sea force and maybe some cannons, and you know, it's nothing. It'd be completely invulnerable to an ancient army. And it's got that kind of lack of pagan history that we talked about already, which would make it appealing to someone such as Constantine. I wanted to maybe say something which is potentially heretical in the field of Byzantine studies, which is Constantinople was potentially an awful site for a capital city. And the reason why is, yes, it allows you to project power outwards because you're at this kind of crossroad of east and west, but it also allows everyone else to project power onto you because you're at the crossroads of east and west. You're such a strategically important location that everyone's going to try and walk over you. And yes, the Theodosian walls were incredible, and whilst you could make them again at the Isthmus of Corinth, the kind of width of the Theodosian walls was about the same as the Corinth Isthmus, which is useful for kind of our alternate history. But whilst they were great, and the Theodosian walls stopped, I think it's nigh on 27 sieges, which is very impressive. Why did those sieges need to happen? Like, the city of London, for example, was not sieged 27 times. It's not like a great thing to have your capital city in such a vulnerable location if you're not able to keep people further back from it. Now, Corinth would be that kind of location where the capital city would just simply not be sacked for a very long time. There's kind of two reasons. One, it's just further back from frontiers. And two is that even before you get to kind of the city and the isthmus, there are natural choke points in kind of the geography of Greece that would kind of be obvious places to fortify and kind of act as kind of barriers, right? And you may have heard of it. It's called Thermopylae. There's a kind of that pass which everyone would have to go through to get from kind of the north down to Corinth, would make an obvious kind of place to kind of wall up, build a fortress, a castle, however it looks, such that Corinth would no longer be kind of exposed. Finally, I wanted to get onto a bit of a topic about maybe broadly why the Byzantine Empire fell. And I was thinking about the best way I could phrase this, and what I came up with was that the Byzantines, or Eastern Romans, or Roman Empire, I don't want to get into that discussion, but the Byzantines were culturally close to people who were geographically distant, and they were geographically close to peoples who were culturally distinct. Right, this is after the kind of 7th, 8th centuries, where you've got kind of large and powerful Islamic civilizations to their kind of south and east, and their kind of natural allies, if you were to put it like that, would be kind of Christians in the west. But they were so far from the Christians in the west that they weren't allies. They were kind of always seen as foreign and a bit different, and they were so close to the steppe and to the various caliphates and emirates, and eventually the Turkish people, who would kind of bring the demise of the Byzantine Empire, that they didn't have a hope in the long run, because they were isolated. And one wonders that if their capital was based in Corinth, which is maybe 1,000 kilometers further west of Constantinople-ish, whether they'd have those links with the West, whether they wouldn't have seen Italy as a far distant province. They would have held that. They would have had more influence in Rome. They could have kind of left the East to its own devices and kind of built allies in the West and been kind of more of a European power as opposed to a Middle Eastern power. Focus on the navy, like Venice and Genoa, and kind of go that kind of way. We're in the realms of complete tinfoil hattery at this point, right? I'm not going to claim that Corinth as the imperial capital would lead to a Byzantine empire that we still have today. But I'm very glad to have shared the idea with you that you can now take away and think about on your own.